Meeting come to order. Commission to improve standards of conduct. And the topic today is crime enforcement. Would begin by having the commissioners introduce themselves. Flo?
Good afternoon. I'm Flo Nakakuni.
Janet?
Hello, I'm Janet Mason from the League of Women Voters.
Barbara?
Barbara Marmoto, former state House of Representatives.
Robert?
Aloha, Robert Harris with the Hawaii State Ethics Commission.
Nikos?
Aloha, Nikos Leverins, Common Cause Hawaii.
And we have a couple of people, I think, from the Campaign Spending Commission sitting in for Kristen. Could you please introduce yourselves?
Aloha, everyone. Tony Baldemero, Associate Director, Campaign Spending.
Thank you. Okay. For the first order of business, approval of the minutes from our June 29, 2022 meeting. Are there any further edits or revisions? If not, the minutes are adopted. And we'll now begin with public testimony. Rona, do we have anybody available for public testimony?
Kat Brady's raising her hand.
Oh, hey, Kat, you're on. Let's see what you have to say.
Kat, unmute please. Hey, Kat, you need to unmute please. Kat, we need you to unmute please.
Kat, can you hear us?
Yeah, okay,
Yeah, could you begin again? You were muted.
sure. I know today we're going to be talking about penalties and the FBI investigation and all of that. I just want to have people think, have laws actually stopped corruption? And to me, it's really more about the process and how the process works or doesn't work, like conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest constantly are no conflict. So nobody really knows in the public. We're sitting in the gallery and we hear, oh, you know, I have a conflict, no conflict, and there it goes. And then legislators who've actually diminished democracy, like Representative Har and her DUI. And yes, she had a good lawyer, but she had no sanctions from the House. And then a year later, Rep. Lopresti gets stopped for drunk driving and refuses a breathalyzer test. So what that says is that really didn't work. People didn't really get it from Har because she just, you know, was like, oh, bad girl, don't do that. Another issue is there are 76 legislators, yet the power is concentrated in the hands of very few people. And they're actually making decisions that we all have to live under with almost no input. So we need to change that. And we need to make every member of the legislature feel accountable for every vote they take. So another issue is committee czars. So when you're a committee chair and you have bills in play, there's intimidation that goes on. And that's really not democratic. Everybody should have a voice. Every voice should be raised and all the discussion should be in public. You know, one of the most frustrating things is at a past conference committee where we were getting into the conferees were getting into a big discussion and one of the legislators said, let's talk offline. And I said, you know, democracy is online. I'm sorry, but we all need to hear what goes on. We know that committee czars have a lot of power because that's how the bribes happen to either pass or kill legislation. So what we need is really systemic change. I mean, you can pass laws. We need to look at the whole process and say something is kind of pilau here. Too much behind the scenes stuff going on. Dissent is basically not permitted. And legislators who speak out are marginalized. We need to make sure that every legislator has a voice. That voice is raised. Those issues are discussed in public. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Do we have any other public testimony, Rona?
No, no one else has.
If we don't, we'll move on to the discussion of strengthening investigation and prosecution of fraud and public corruption. I'm going to turn it over to Flo to lead this part.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Barbara Maramoto and I are the facilitators for this afternoon's program. So this commission was created by the State House of Representatives in February of this year, just 2 days after two former state legislators pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud charges in connection with taking bribes from a local businessman in exchange for influencing legislation. And just last year, also in federal court, 5 employees of the city's planning and permitting department were charged with honest services fraud for accepting bribes. And one of the persons who paid bribes was also charged. I think several people have pleaded guilty. The first has been sentenced and received a 30-month federal prison sentence. And 2 more, I think, are scheduled for trial next month. And we also have the wire fraud conspiracy charge against the 3 former high-level city officials. And one of them specifically is charged with 5 counts of making material false statements to the FBI agents during the course of the investigation. And of course, we have the case of the former prosecuting attorney for Honolulu and his 4 co-defendants also charged with conspiracy to commit honest services fraud and other crimes. So these cases are evidence of a serious problem of corruption in our state. And all of these cases, including the case of the former chief and his former prosecuting attorney wife, are all federal cases. Why is that? I think we all know it's because there are serious challenges and limitations on state law, and federal law is more tailored to charge corruption. And when I was a federal prosecutor, I really appreciated the fact that we had the mail and wire fraud statutes, which allowed you to charge a scheme to defraud. And scheme is important because none of these cases involve a one-time lapse of judgment. In fact, in many of these cases, the corrupt conduct spans years, as Jeff here knows. And these schemes also include honest services. If you have anyone with a fiduciary duty has a duty of honest services. And if you violate this duty, you're committing a crime. And so our first presenters today are 2 agents with the FBI here in Honolulu. And first, before I introduce them, some ground rules. The FBI comes under the Department of Justice, and Department of Justice policy does not allow any of its employees to comment on or participate in state legislative processes. So they can't answer any questions about existing or proposed state laws. And they also cannot answer questions about pending or even recently concluded cases. But they will discuss the FBI's National Public Corruption Program and the most frequently used federal statutes for public corruption cases. Let me first start by introducing Matt McDonald. Are you?
Yep.
Okay, I see you. Okay, so I'd like to introduce FBI Supervisory Special Agent Matt McDonald. Matt is also the Assistant Division Counsel for the FBI Honolulu Division. He's also headed the FBI's white collar squad here in Honolulu. And in person with us is FBI Supervisory Agent Jeff Fellman, who now heads the white collar squad here in Hawaii. And I've worked with both of these agents. They know what they're doing. We have the accountant, we have the lawyer. And so I will ask you to begin the presentation.
I'll go ahead and start, Matt, and introduce myself and say a few things. And then I'll let Matt follow up. As Flo had said, he's the attorney, I'm the accountant, and I'll defer to him in many instances. So I know some of you. It's a pleasure to be here today with the work that we've done here over the years. I've been with the Bureau this September will actually be 35 years for me. I managed to start with the Bureau when I was going through college and eventually become a special agent with the FBI. A lot of my time was in Los Angeles area, working various programs and things that we work, but eventually public corruption in Los Angeles, to which I transferred out here in 2007. And that was about the same time that Matt McDonald also started his career with us in the FBI. And we've worked primarily public corruption for our time here in Hawaii, and know a number of you from our interactions with cases that we've had. And so we've, I have to say that definitely the work that we've done, we've have worked on some good cases, and glad to see some of the results that are occurring and the interest from the community and the state. And we hope that we can answer any of your questions that we might in helping you guys do what you need to do. And I'll turn it over to Matt to introduce himself.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. I'm a little bit under the weather and I didn't want to put anybody at risk. But like Jeff said, I joined the Bureau in 2006. And prior to that, I was a Marine Corps officer. And prior to that, I was a deputy prosecuting attorney in California. And when I arrived here in the Honolulu division in 2006, it was sort of a time where we were starting to really kind of dial in and focus on public corruption and start developing our program to address it. And then Jeff came in 2007, and with his wide experience from LA, we were really able to start putting things together and building a team from the ground up. Like Flo says, it between the two of us, I think we have kind of a good skill set to address corruption. Jeff is the accountant, as the numbers guy, me as an attorney, kind of bringing both halves, which are very valuable in addressing this sort of criminal activity. Like Jeff says, he might defer to me about legal things, and I would definitely defer to him when it comes to numbers and dollars and cents. But we are definitely honored that we were invited to come speak with you, and we hope that we can provide some insight into how we do what we do, that it might help the state kind of further develop and flesh out their ability to address this issue at a state level, vice being purely dealt with by the federal authorities. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yes, as Flo had commented earlier, a lot of our cases, for us being supervisors for the white collar crime squad, we either have schemes to defraud or we have public corruption. And with your schemes to defraud, it's swindling somebody out of their money, and investment schemes, Ponzi schemes and such. On the public corruption side, generally that's where there's a bribe or an extortion, a pay to play. And one of the main statutes that we're usually looking at or addressing when we get in any of those cases to start off is 18 USC code 666 for honest services fraud that Flo had mentioned. And generally that means that somebody in a position of trust, whether it's local, state, or federal, has, and if you'll go ahead and you can click through to about the middle where you'll get to 18 USC 666. Right there. Yeah. So generally we're looking at cases initially to determine that the case that we have, somebody is in a position in which they've taken money from somebody else to do something that they wouldn't normally do for others, has taken taking advantage of the position that they're in. And usually the federal nexus for us in those cases is because whatever position they're in, there is some federal funds that is going to that program that allows us to work on that case. And for 666, that means that within a 1 calendar year, there's at least $10,000 that has gone from federal funds into whatever it is that this person is working for or associated to. Kind of an example is you might have correctional guards here at the state prisons, and they are receiving bribes to take contraband into the prison. And if we have evidence that they've done that for $5,000 of cash or something of value for that that period of time, then there is the federal funds that go to the prison system for $10,000 or more for the year. That allows us to address that matter on the federal side. Matt, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that, like Jeff said, that the 666 is really one of our kind of bread and butter base statutes that we like, that we rely on. I think it's important for the commission to remember that, you know, the FBI and the federal government, you know, we're limited in our ability to police certain things because it has to be, we have to tie it to, you know, the Interstate Commerce Clause or something along those lines. Here in 666, we tie it to federal funding, and therefore that gives us our federal hook into the ability to enforce this statute. So anything that this commission's considering recommending in the future, you know, doesn't need to be as limited as this is for the state to be involved to enforce it. As far as, you know, like federal bribery statute, this is the statute that we use in place of a state bribery statute. The federal bribery statute applies to federal employees, and it's constrained in that manner. So for us, 666 is the way that we can kind of address state and local level bribery activity, and stay within the confines of the Constitution.
I have a question. So, for example, for 666 purposes, an entity such as the Honolulu Police Department, if it receives more than $10,000 in federal funds, then someone working there would fall within this statute if the conduct does.
That's correct. Yeah, $10,000 within a calendar year from a federal program or federal funds to the Honolulu Police Department or a PD or any other organization, that then opens the door for us to work a case in that matter. If somebody is using their position to receive something of value of $5,000 or more, in whatever manner, using their position to take advantage of it and receive things of value for somebody in exchange for something else generally.
So this includes grant money, right?
Yes, yes.
And Flo, it can move upstream, you know, possibly from an agency to the state itself. You know, the state receives a lot of federal fundings. Most all state entities receive in excess of $10,000 in federal program funds in some way, shape, or form over a year period. So it's usually not a very high burden to get over, but it is something that we have to comply with to stay within the statute.
I wanted to ask about a very big claim in dollar terms, catastrophic claim, say $500,000, that perhaps involves a state employee, but also includes financial institution employees. Is that a way that you can tap into the investigation, or is that left to the state?
That the financial employees might be,
Yeah, complicit or,
and it's, I mean, it may then fall into a different financial scheme, which we may look at it through wire fraud or mail fraud, and not necessarily under public corruption.
okay. Because isn't it true that the really catastrophic claims that occur are wire fraud claims in terms of dollar amounts?
Yes, that's true. A little bit more, or what?
Hey, Jeff,
Or-
can I
yeah,
chime in a
sure.
second? Sorry. Ma'am, I think wire fraud is just another the wire fraud is another tool in our toolkit. 666 is one which doesn't necessarily require a wire or a mailing or something like that. Again, the wire fraud statute, the mail fraud statutes are all ways that the federal government is able to tie in-state criminal conduct by using intrastate mechanisms and therefore applying the Interstate Commerce Clause as part of their law enforcement activity. So yes, you're correct that wire fraud inherently is many times a tool that we use as well as 666. The 666 could apply if somebody hands somebody an envelope full of $10,000, totally within the state of Hawaii. That isn't going to implicate necessarily the mail fraud or wire fraud statutes, but 666 could be used to kind of apply to that activity. The devil's in the details, of course, but you are correct that yes, the wire fraud and mail fraud statutes are also very powerful tools that we use in addressing these things. And again, the state has the ability, should they choose to define. That's not me, I don't think. But the state has the ability, and I think Flo mentioned it previously, with the scheme to defraud. The scheme to defraud is a very broad categorization of we'll say criminal conduct that can be used, that we can use. So for the wire fraud and the mail fraud, we've got to have a scheme to defraud and a wire being an email, a phone call, whatever it may be, or somebody mailing something using the mail system. Again, the state's not limited in that respect. That the reason we use those statutes is because of our limited nature as the federal government in policing certain activities. But yes, the wire fraud is also is a powerful statute, but the concept, I think more salient to the question you're asking, I think, is the concept of a scheme to defraud is very important and a very powerful thing that is maybe broader than the theft statutes that are presently on the books in the state of Hawaii.
So, I mean, we're generally looking at it because somebody has received something of value in order to give something back. And it might be a contract that's in $500,000 or millions of dollars, but it's actually that it's being unfairly awarded to somebody because they provided them with something else. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Jeff.
I have a question. First of all, I'd like to say, Jeff and Matt, thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to put this question out to either or both of you, beginning maybe with Matt. If you could identify any particular obstacles or problems you have in investigating state or county official or employees' corruption. or misuse of federal funds. Are there any particular problems you've encountered?
The list is long. I think that's day to day. I mean, the job is to put the case together, is to overcome those.
Has been reported in this building. Please cease operations and leave the building utilizing the nearest.
I assume that's in the conference room, but I think the issues that we have are various. I mean, it can be from piecing things together to meet the requirements of a statute, to collecting the evidence, to having the people and witnesses in the right place. I mean, there's all those sorts of things. We're lucky in that we have we have subpoena power and the federal grand jury system, which helps us cut through a lot of I think some of the stumbling blocks that may exist at the state level. Our ability to issue a subpoena and get bank records back relatively quickly, so that we can analyze and kind of maintain a battle rhythm in our cases and keep things moving forward, is critical. From the time we identify some sort of criminal conduct to the time we're able to prosecute it, these cases take a long time, and so we're constantly racing against the clock. And so probably that's one of the biggest obstacles we face, is detecting the activity, putting the case together, and charging it in sufficient amount of time. And again, usually the federal statutes of limitations are generally 5 years. There's some that are longer, but maintaining that battle rhythm is critical, and maintaining that momentum. And so anything we can do to keep our momentum going is very important. And as you've seen with some of the cases in the past, and again, we can't really speak to anything in particular, but these things take a long time because they're very complex, and we leave no stone unturned. And so that's how we do it. Jeff, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, just wanted to highlight on what you had said. I mean, for us, Matt and I have both worked with our state and local partners quite a bit over the years. And what Matt had said about some of the things that we do that we see that are very difficult for the state and local law enforcement folks to do, or the prosecutors to do. We still have a difficult time in doing what we do, but it's a little easier. What he had mentioned about the use of our federal grand jury and the ability, the subpoena power versus search warrants for a lot of things. It does give us a little bit more ease in moving things along that we know that our partners might not be able to do, whether it's subpoenaing financial records or even toll records.
Attention, an emergency has been.
So when I say toll records, I mean phone records, as to who called who. As we piece things together and understand what we have going on in a case, that helps a lot. And that's something that is not sometimes as easy to do on the state side. With our folks, I try to have, recently we had all of the prosecutors from the county and the state and the federal side come and meet with our agents so we could discuss some of those challenges that we have. So if we do work together on cases, we can try to make sure that we do the right thing. And usually trying to do the right thing is making sure that we're doing the right thing if we're working together on a state case, because that's where the real challenge is. Matt?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jeff, Jeff highlights a really important point. I think is that subpoena power is very important, and I want to highlight that those issues don't just impact public corruption cases; they impact all cases that state and local law enforcement are trying to address as well. Their need to do search warrants for things where we can, do a subpoena. It can really be, I think, hinder their ability to maintain momentum sometimes. If we had to do subpoena or search warrants for everything we did a subpoena for, it'd be next to impossible.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. So can you talk about, in general, how you might get some of these cases? If you can explain how these cases come in, or how they start.
I'll start it off and then I'll let Matt catch up with anything that I might miss. But generally we'll receive calls just like the local police department will as well. So folks will call in and we'll start a complaint, or like the PD would start a report, and we would assess what we have. Generally that they come in from the public as such, or we have our online reports that you may do through ic3.gov. And those will come in and then get directed to us, and we'll do an assessment on what we have to vet things out and see if we have a case. But then as we start building a case and working with folks on the federal side, you may have cooperators who assist, and it turns into other new cases for us along the way. Any other?
Yeah, Jeff, I think those are the two main ones. I mean, we also we look at the media, and monitor kind of, the news and whatnot for any indications where there may be some sort of criminal activity. We have a certain threshold that we have to reach before we're really going to open an investigation. And it's generally not going to be just kind of a single data point that's going to lead us to do something. If we do receive a complaint from someone, we've got to vet that out before we really are going to officially, quote unquote, open something and go after it. But we can intake anonymous complaints and media reports and all sorts of things, and use that as the basis for a case opening. It doesn't need to be sworn.
And the one other area I can think of is that we do our best to keep a good relationship with everybody, whether it's ethics folks or other local and state agencies. And so we'll somebody else may get a lead that may be more appropriate for us on the federal side, or we may have something that we can't address, but we can then turn it over to ethics or campaign spending commission. And there's a decent amount of cases that will come from the network relationships.
Jeff, you're going to move on to the next section.
Any one of the we had the next slide on our PowerPoint is 1001. It's 18 USC 1001, and that's false statements, and that, along with witness tampering or obstruction of justice, those are usually items that, okay, we may be starting a case and getting into it because of honest services fraud, but as we're doing our investigation, using the grand jury or conducting interviews and speaking with people, it's usually those folks not being forthcoming or wanting to conceal something that will lead to us looking at false statements to federal officers, being the FBI, or to the grand jury, that we will follow up on in those cases. Maybe we don't end up using 666, but it's because of the lies and the false statements for us on the federal side that we end up charging somebody with.
Yeah,
I will let Matt chime in.
Okay. Yeah. Jeff highlights one of I think our most useful tools is the 1001, the false statement statute. We have a saying in our business that the cover up is worse than the crime, and a lot of times that is the case. And the 1001 statute, along with some of the other obstruction statutes, 1519, 1512, are useful in helping to kind of corral that obstructive conduct that we tend to see in these sorts of investigations. The nature of public corruption investigations is rarely people will kind of throw their arms up and say, "Oh, you got me." We really have to kind of have our I's dotted and our T's crossed. And in getting to that point, a lot of times people will tell us things that aren't necessarily so. And this 1001 is a really powerful weapon, and it's something that we'll remind people about when we're talking to them. Like, hey, it's you're treading in some dangerous waters with what you may be saying, because it's not. It is an important tool that we use to help capture, again, obstructive conduct and conduct that's sort of unbecoming in not showing respect to the laws. And again, I don't know if the state has something similar to this, but again, it's a very powerful tool that we have in addressing these sorts of cases.
Yeah, so as we had noted, either this is because someone is making false statements to us as federal investigators, but for a lot of our, we've got a lot of, we'll work fraud against the government cases where we have federal programs, say HUD mortgage loans. And with a lot of those federal programs, somewhere along the line, you sign something that everything is true and correct. And the 1001 notification is written on there that if you are not, then you are then subject to 1001. And I don't know that we see that with some of the in the state area, if that may be something to think about in terms of putting people on notice as they're handling themselves in the public arena. I guess so the next slide is 1510, and the one after that is 1512, which Matt had mentioned briefly, being obstruction of justice or witness tampering. And for our public corruption cases, as we're working the case, and maybe we're having difficulties in putting things together for this case being a historical matter, but we're interviewing witnesses and victims and subjects. There are times often where we have someone who is looking to influence somebody's possible grand jury testimony or their statements to us. And if we can collect evidence in that, then this is where we might end up in our public corruption cases.
And I think it's important to note, hey, sometimes the underlying criminal conduct may be outside, may not end up being something we charge. The reason we initiate the case may not necessarily be the thing that we end up going to trial on at the end of the day, because of a statute of limitation issue or some sort of proof or something like that. However, the obstructive conduct that kind of precipitated out of that investigation could be something that we might pursue. Again, another way to address the conduct that may be outside of the statute, because these cases do take so long, and sometimes we're late to the game by the time we find out about something. it's long gone. However, as we start looking at it, the obstructive conduct might be something that if engaged in and if it hindered our investigation would be something that could be charged.
Good. The next one that I wanted to touch on is back towards the beginning of the slides. It's 18 USC 371 conspiracy. Yep, there you go. And this too, just as the other two, obstruction of justice or witness tampering, as we're working through the case and we have evidence of a conspiracy in the matter, it allows us to capture some of those events that if we are running out of time on our 5-year statute of limitations, if there's a conspiracy if we can prove a conspiracy in it, then that'll allow us to go back and capture those historical events outside of that 5 years.
Yeah, as Jeff highlights, like there can be acts in furtherance of the conspiracy that may be after the kind of initial allegation or the underlying criminal conduct, and those things can kind of help us stay in the game, so to speak. I'm sure there's a conspiracy statute on the state within the state laws. I don't know if it tracks specifically the federal statute though, but I would assume it's relatively similar. But again, this is another powerful tool that we use for these sorts of cases.
Yeah, we have a few others here, but I think those are pretty much the crux of what we are looking at when we're working on public corruption matters and cases for us. Any questions?
Questions?
Barbara?
Barbara?
I want to thank you for coming here today and for your work. You know, when you do prosecute somebody, it kind of restores public confidence in law enforcement. And, you know, people are losing confidence in their government in Hawaii and also on the national level. So, you know, more power to you. Please keep up the good work. And thank you for coming today.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say myself, having worked for the Bureau for as long as I have and the things that I've done, I mean, I appreciate everything that I've done, but in working public corruption in Los Angeles and cases in LA, there's a lot of cases to work in LA, a lot of work, and easy to make a case, and good work's being done by our folks in Los Angeles. But coming here and having worked here and working with some of the folks that we've worked with and the prosecutors that we've worked with over the years, I mean, I've really enjoyed it and it's been very rewarding. And I know both Matt and I and the other folks we work with, looking at some of the cases that we choose to work here, that's what we're always thinking about, as hopefully that does make change. And it's been very nice to see the community watching these cases and seeing the things that are going on and bringing us here today, obviously. So thank you for letting us be here.
Yeah, we'd like to replicate some of your methods and maybe perhaps some of your laws. So thank you so much.
And we're both welcome to be available anytime.
Okay, you heard that.
Nicholas, do you have any questions, Nicholas? Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jeff. So next we have Steve the current Honolulu prosecuting attorney. My former boss at the U.S. Attorney's Office, my current boss at the prosecutor's office. And Steve is speaking in his capacity today as former U.S. Attorney for Hawaii. So Steve, if you could discuss federal public corruption cases as you know them.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Flo. Chair Foley. You know, it was an active time for doing corruption cases at the U.S. Attorney's Office when I was there. Great AUSAs, great federal agents working on it. You know, Councilman Andy Merivitani, former Speaker Danny Quijano, Milton Holt, Gary Rodriguez, and our own Flo Nakakuni was the trial attorney in that. But I agree with what was said. It restores public confidence because they know there's some criminal activity going on. So people are actually held accountable. It's really good. And I would echo what our FBI partners have said, that the cases come in different ways. Partly some guy gets jammed up on one criminal case, but he may know something about a political figure. And so they'll profit that. For Gary Rodriguez, I think it helped that I had been a local prosecutor when I became U.S. attorney, so I had good relationships with HPD. So one day, one of the people in the intelligence unit that at that time had a very good reputation, it's since been sullied by what happened to KLOS, but they called the office and said, we've got somebody here talking about Gary Rodriguez, and we want to share that. And there happened to be an excellent investigator from the racketeering department named Justice. He and Flo drove down to HPD, and I think you were there for like 8 hours the first day. That's what it takes, you know, and it takes, I think there's trust in us that we'll handle it with all the agencies. And so each case is often developed that way. So people have to believe that you want to do the cases, that you know, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, have got a very good reputation for this. We would certainly hope to try to bring some of that to the prosecutor's office since I'm there now. And because Flo's there and Tom Brady's there and I'm there, we do have a good relationship with the federal agencies and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And partly, I feel our office has an obligation to try to do some of these cases. They shouldn't automatically go to the Fed. They should go to the Feds if the state falls short or the city prosecutors fall short. But we look forward to working with them on cases. And I think that the climate, and because of the cases that you folks have done, the climate at the legislature is much better as far as getting stuff passed. So I look forward to working with the other county prosecutors and working in our state attorney general's office to come up with a series of legislation that mirror what the feds are doing. And it could even be, as they've said, broader in some ways, because I remember at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you had to find the federal book. Either there was a statute on point or affected interstate commerce. So we had these, you know, this purse snatching ring that had, you know, thousands of cases, literally. Well, you know, a lot of work was done showing that people cut their vacations short when they were the subject of this or their friend was. That affects interstate commerce. So there's always a way to do it. We had a crooked lawyer in town who ripped off a woman whose son had been, he was a doorman at FEMNU, got killed. So he, you know, he had an arrangement to make money from that. Well, she got an insurance settlement. He said, well, I get a third of that too, you know, and we figured whatever else he's doing, he's probably not reporting it on his federal income tax. So that became the way to bring that case in. One thing that is hugely important though, is that in the federal system, most people go to prison. And that provides the incentive for A, people to want to take care of their own case, and B, to cooperate against somebody else. And so what it may take for us to be able to do these cases successfully is mandatory prison time on all of the charges, because then they'll cooperate against somebody else. Right now, people are optimists. They'll think, even if I get caught, I'm not going to go to prison. So when I was the U.S. attorney, I get a call from HPD saying, we've got this guy, we think he's the key guy in a meth trafficking group. He got arrested by the state. They have, you know, they have a meth statute, right? Well, they do, but the paroling authority sets the minimum. So people's optimism may be, yeah, it's a 20-year term for the judge, but the paroling authority can set it really low. And so people's optimism overcomes it. So eventually, I had a couple of conversations with Keith Kaneshiro, and after certain things were said, he magnanimously agreed that we should take that case. And it became a big OCDF case with 20 or 30 defendants, but it never would have worked at state court because there's no minimum, there's no, to encourage that kind of participation. So if that could be a part of it, any statutes we do, then I think that's the way to make our, investigations and getting cooperation from people successful. Because without that, it's not gonna work. So anyway, I was really, yeah, go ahead.
Just a comment on that. No, I definitely completely agree. For us, working with our local partners and watching the individuals that are in and out of prison here, short time. And if we can put something together that there's a federal nexus on, when you receive your sentence, you're going to do that sentence. It's what you do before that, receiving that sentence, in cooperating with us and helping us with other matters that may reduce that sentence based off of what the judge may decide. But very, very hard, I believe, to watch the local law enforcement on the state side try to do what they do, and you see the same individuals that are in and out all the time.
So it's possible, and judges have tremendous amount of discretion on sentencing, but often it is going to be a probationary sentence, even for what I would think is serious crimes. And so but I look forward to it. And in our office, we do have a vigorous white collar section. Chris Dunbar has been in this case for years, so he's worked with these guys. And, it can be done, but we will need new statutes. I look forward, like I say, working with the Attorney General's office and the other county prosecutors to come up with a good package of cases, looking at the federal statutes, maybe making them better, but things that really jump out, are the false statements, because that is something that if somebody tells 5 different groups things, or 3 times interviewed with law enforcement, and then a couple times in grand jury, they're not going to be saying the same thing if they're up to no good. And that's an important part of the whole thing. Same, lying to law enforcement is huge, and that gives them a great, we've seen that in some of the local cases recently, and may see more in the future because often people are not going to be straight. And as was said, white collar criminals really have a hard time admitting guilt. They do not want to, they don't see themselves as criminals like other people. I'm different. I'm not like those other people. So it's really hard to get them to admit guilt. So they may want to go to trial unless they're really squeezed on it. So anyway, the federal system works really well right now. They've got good statutes, but you've also seen they've got very experienced investigators working on these cases for years. And it is good. Hawaii being small, you can have a real impact if people pay attention to it. And, and can, I think, deter crime. You can't deter violent crime, but you can deter white collar crime, including political corruption. So what has been done with these cases is wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Oh,
if I may.
okay, sorry, Judge.
Yeah, the commission would really look forward to a proposed package from law enforcement, from the county prosecutors, attorney general, on statutes and sentencing. But your last point, resources. What sort of resources does state and county law enforcement have as compared to the federal law enforcement to investigate and prosecute state and county corruption?
Well, there's some good HPD detectives, and they started a cyber crimes unit. It keeps our white collar prosecutors extremely busy because they're always doing it. We are looking at the investigative grand jury because, folks like Flo and Tom Brady have had so much success with that, and the U.S. Attorney's Office working with the FBI, that might be another way, because we have to go to get search warrants on everything. They can get the subpoenas, and keeping momentum rolling is important. There probably would be more, some resources, another, deputy prosecutor or another investigator. We're trying to find an investigator in our office with a good skill set to embed them with that unit. But it's going to be, and we appreciate the offer for the FBI to be working with them to help develop these cases, particularly at the beginning. We get a team from HPD and with our office, and maybe with the FBI's help, and maybe work with the Attorney General's office. We can come up with some good stuff.
Yeah, I don't think our resources are any more than the local resources per se. You know, Honolulu PD's CID division is generally the same as ours. It's, yeah, what is their focus and what is our focus? What can we do and what can they do? Over the years, since I've been here, where we've had the HIDA, High Intensity Drug Task Force, that's always been here and it's been good over the years in terms of the locals working with the feds, having local detectives that are task force officers. They now can run a federal case and work with the United States Attorney's Office on cases. And they know very well to discuss the cases with the state prosecutors and federal prosecutors to determine which way may be the better way to go for the better sentence in the case. In the last few years, we've had more success in more federal initiative to get Safe Streets Task Force and Violent Crime Task Force, and we're able to bring the local PDs on board, detectives from each department. So now we end up having a good group of folks working on cases. A lot of the local folks know stuff that Matt and I don't necessarily know, obviously. And we are actually in the process of developing a white collar crime task force here in Hawaii. That's getting going, and we hope we see that come around. But that's been working out more so in the last few years, and we're seeing the benefits of that. Generally, you see it where the detectives all of a sudden realize now they've got some federal statutes and somebody's going to get a sentence and they're going to go to jail and not come back for a while.
Hey,
Yes.
Matt's
hey
got a-
Jeff, can I chime in on something with that? I do think, as everybody's highlighted, that we want to work with the state and locals, and we do, and I think we do it as effectively as we can, given the legal framework that we're addressing. Here, unfortunately, a lot of times you've got to make the decision on, okay, is it, and this isn't, I'm not really speaking about necessarily corruption cases, but some of the state's safe streets cases and things like that. You've got to make that decision, okay, is it going to go state or federal early on in the investigation? Because if the Bureau uses some of its investigative techniques that might require a search warrant or something like that at the state level, but at the federal level, it doesn't, the case can't necessarily go to the state. And I think that's a limiting factor in the way that some of the state laws are structured, making it difficult at late stage in an investigation as you're dividing up subjects to send certain subjects to the state if federal techniques or federal subpoenas or whatnot have been used, because it limits the ability to prosecute those individuals sometimes. So that's something that again, if there was a statutory package is put forward, that would be some kind of a vulnerability that might be able to be addressed effectively.
Yeah, definitely.
Any more questions for former U.S. Attorney?
Nico's has his hand up. Nico's?
Oh, I'm sorry, Nico.
Hi, thank you to all of our presenters today. And thank you to Judge Alm for being there in person. I was wondering if Judge Alm could talk about his comment related to the Hawaii Paroling Authority and its impact in sentencing, and whether Hawaii in the set of these cases should move toward or more determine, give it back to the legislature to set something like a determinant sentence with aggravating and mitigating factors, and also giving judges discretion as well. Could you further clarify your comment on that?
Well, the way it works now is if it's a Class A felony, the judge gives the guy 20 years. After several months, they go in front of the paroling authority who sets the real minimum. But at least I think a third of the folks don't get out when their minimum's done because they haven't finished programming. So it's not the greatest system. On the other hand, I think a lot of the prosecutors over the years have more faith in the paroling authority than they do in the judges. So it's a difficult issue to handle. And I've gone back and forth on it about doing it, about giving, we don't want the legislature to be setting mandatory minimums on things that ties the judge's hands. But at the same time, you know, I've thought about having judges involved because the judges can be involved in plea agreements in the state system. They can't in the federal system. So instead of a 10-year term for a burglary in the first degree, the judge and the two attorneys could get together and say, this guy should get 5 years. And then that would be the sentence. It would not be a minimum, it would be the sentence. And then the Hawaii Paroling Authority would know. We have, or the Department of Public Safety would know, we have 5 years to work with this person. So that will start right there. Because they don't start programming until they set the minimum. So that often delays several months. This is a complicated issue. I think I certainly want to discuss it with my fellow prosecutors and you know, the AG before trying to upend that whole system. But because there are other ways to work on it. And I have to say, because what the paroling authority does is kind of like a second sentencing. And I think Judge Foley was involved in helping set up the, you know, the way the system works. But they look at a criminal history, they look at circumstances of the initial, so they may well be more consistent in dealing with the people that come in front of them than the judges all over the state. So it really is, you know, it may be time to revisit some of that stuff.
I'd just like to add to that, as Judge Alms, I did write the rules and regulations of the paroling authority. I'm fairly familiar with it. There is no more powerful paroling authority in the United States. Once the judge decides whether someone goes to prison or probation, the judge is finished. And certain categories, the judge can't even decide that. It's mandatory maximum. But it's the paroling authority that actually decides how much time people serve, when they get out, when they come back, when they get out again. And members of the paroling authority are not attorneys, or don't have to be, or not judges. And quite often, other than the pre-sentence report and a workup from the prison, only have 5 minutes with the person. That's it. And they process a lot. So it's a system, maybe not for this commission to look at, but at some time we should look back and say, how did this come about, and whether it's still valid.
Steve, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So our next presentation is by the Office of the Attorney General, and the AG takes a leading role in proposing new criminal laws here in the state to supplement existing laws. So joining us today are Attorney General Hale Shikata and Deputy Attorneys General Chuk Fului and Gary Yamashiroya.
Thank you. I'm actually going to let the deputy.
All right, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Louis. So I am a Deputy Attorney General in the Criminal Justice Division, CJD short, which is the criminal prosecuting arm of the Department of the Attorney General. So CJD is a lot smaller than the county prosecutors, but as a statewide prosecuting agency, we do investigate and prosecute public corruption crimes, fraudulent crimes, government employee misconduct, etc. Especially those offenses that involve state monies. Usually those are the cases that we would take instead of the county prosecutor. In just a minute, I'll let Ms. Shikata to talk about the brand new unit or division that with the blessing and support of the legislature that she has created. I think that's a lot more exciting. But before she does that, I think it's worth mentioning that the Department of the Attorney General is actively looking at and drafting new bills for the next legislative session to combat or to target public corruption and fraud. At this time, it is, we're at a very preliminary stage, so I don't think we're in a position the specific language of the new bills. But we are, for example, studying similar statutes, like for example, on services fraud, wire fraud, and looking at how the federal courts have been interpreting them. We're also looking at other state jurisdictions to see what kind of statute they use to for public corruption, and see how that will work within our state law. As you can imagine, fraud and public corruption, they can take many forms. It's not just financial fraud. It's not just money. Obviously, within our existing state law, we have our limitations, and a lot of them is about value, how much value determines the grade of the offenses. We may have to go beyond that, just because a lot of times, again, it's not just financial fraud that constitutes public corruption. We are aiming to cast a wider net without being too overbroad. And this may involve amending some of the existing statutes, but more importantly, we want to create, new felony offenses in the order by statutes, specifically for public corruption and fraud. And as the special agents have stated, the one challenge that public corruption and fraud cases, when investigating and prosecuting, is the time that it takes. You have to follow the money. And a lot of times more than money, but there are a lot of documents that we have to go after. It takes time, especially because we do have to do search warrants. So we are also considering how we can extend the statute of limitations on those. There is already a section for public officials in regards to statute of limitation. However, it is still very limited. And so we'll be considering what we can do to extend this as well. This time I'll turn it back to Shikata to talk about the new division. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have to say that I am very grateful that Louis is looking at these statutes and he and there are others, of course, in our criminal justice division that are looking at the statutes and trying to determine what things we might need to be revising, what these statutes we need. And it truly is very preliminary because once we, kind of come together with our thoughts on what we might want to do, we absolutely need to be working with the whole prosecutor's office as well as all the other common prosecutors to make sure that we're all in sync in terms of what. So we were very fortunate this past legislative session. The legislature gave us a lot of funding to start up a new section. We are actually creating a special investigations and prosecution division. Within that division, there will be two sections. One will be corruption, fraud, and economic crimes. And they will be handling the fraud, economic crimes, and public corruption type cases. They'll work closely with our criminal justice division, as well as what we have is a complex litigation division as well that handles mainly complex civil cases, but any kind of complex litigation cases they will be involved in. And so we will have two, I think, very well-armed divisions that will be able to handle these types of cases and are expected to work very closely together. That would be this new division as well as our existing criminal justice division. We still have other cases, environmental crimes, nuisance abatement type cases, and anything affecting state properties and having impact on the state. So this new division will also have a section for human trafficking cases. So they will be all under one division. The unit's going to have one supervising deputy attorney general. We're anticipating that to start with 5 deputy attorneys general. 3 of them will be on the corruption, fraud, and economic crime side, and 2 on the human trafficking abatement side. We will also have 7 investigators, and we're looking at 3 forensic analysts. We currently have 3 forensic analysts. They work with our complex litigation division. They are fantastic. They really dig deep into the documents and information that is brought to them by investigators as well as their own investigations. The 3 forensic analysts that we currently have are former federal investigators, so they know their stuff and they've been doing great work for us. We will also be having one human trafficking abatement coordinator and one human services professional that will be like our victim witness specialist. And of course, we'll have legal assistance and legal clerks. So we are really excited to get this started. We are currently working to staff the division and we're anticipating filling some of those positions shortly. So we're well on our way. We are hoping that next session will be ready with our package of the types of changes that we hope will be within to the law so that our two divisions can do their best to attack all of the public corruption, fraud, and economic crimes that are going on.
Any questions for Ms. Shikata?
I just got back from the mainland and I haven't been keeping up with the news too much, but I think I saw some clip of a news story about somebody from the sheriff's office announcing this new division and that all the investigators would be statewide would be in one group. Is that?
So what has happened is last session, the law passed to create a new department. So there will be a department of law enforcement. And that department is really one that is coming out of the Department of Public Safety. So public safety will be split. Public safety will have a corrections and rehabilitation side, which will become a new department on its own. And then there's this new department of law enforcement. And so it will be the sheriffs. Many of our investigators from our department will be going over there. The harbors law enforcement folks will be going over there. We also have our Homeland Security people going over. So it's going to be a whole new department that is going to be state law enforcement.
And their focus more so on the
State property crimes, yes.
violent crimes and
Violent crimes, yes. So, you know, it was something that's been in discussion, as I understand it, for the last 20 years. And it's gone into different forms at different times with people talking about it, but it's never really come to fruition. And this past legislative session is finally done.
How will it affect your division for fraud and public corruption?
I don't think it will affect us negatively. I think it could be a very positive impact because we will have another department of law enforcement who will be informing us of potential cases out there. And we will have investigators within our Special Investigations and Prosecution Division as well. So we will still have investigators in our department, but about half of our investigation division will be going to the law enforcement.
Okay, I was thinking maybe everybody would be swept into this new.
No, because we still have statutory obligations in the Attorney General's office that we need to fulfill, which requires us to have investigators so that we can investigate and fulfill our statutorily obligated areas.
Thank you.
yeah, we see our violent crimes task force and our gang task force more active with this Department of Public Safety group that's coming along
Yes.
versus public corruption and fraud.
Well, maybe there might be some overlap.
Oh, there may be,
And
But-
overlap's not a bad thing.
not a bad thing.
Because that would be, I think, a lot more resources together, working together. The key is working together and collaborating, which I think, you know, we're all committed to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shikata.
Flo, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
About that? I do think the collaboration is really critical, not only amongst, law enforcement agency to law enforcement agency, but also law enforcement agency to prosecutor. And that was something that I don't think we really highlighted when we were talking earlier, when the Bureau's working these cases, we're involving our prosecutors in the activity at a very early stage and working things jointly, so that we can shape and sculpt that case so that we get kind of the best product at the end of the day. And that's kind of something that is a force multiplier for us in how we do things.
Thank you. Louis, do you have anything else to add? Holly, anything else? Okay, Gary back there. Thank you. Now we have with us two former AGs, Marjorie Bronster and Doug Chin. Marjorie is here in person and Doug is on Zoom. So, we're as a commission, we're interested in hearing your perspective on what's been presented thus far. And since you're here, Marjorie, would you like to start?
Well, actually, I thought the presentations were wonderful. I was really quite thrilled to have been included, not because of what I'm going to say, but because I really enjoyed the process. And one of the things that came up to me was that there were a lot of questions that came to my mind. And so I thought maybe one of the things I could do here is share them with you, and if you think they're worthy, maybe share them and actually go on to some of the presenters. I also have, it also brought back a lot of memories for me, because I did not have a background in criminal law before I became the Attorney General. I was a civil litigator and had been for not that many years. But when I first got involved, I realized that the legislature was looking to the Attorney General's office to put together proposed legislation. And although there were some very quality people in the office, I certainly was not aware of what needed to be done. And so we called together, my office called together what we call the Law Enforcement Coalition. And that's how I first got to know Steve Long, because what we did was we called together the 4 prosecuting attorneys from the 4 counties, 4 chiefs of police, and then the U.S. Attorney was an ex officio member of our group. And the purpose of it was to come together and try to vet all of the criminal law proposals, not to necessarily tell people not to do things, but if there was agreement on what would work and what was needed so that the Law Enforcement Coalition could put its stamp of approval on the bills, that really thought had more clout, the potential for more clout in the legislature than simply having the prosecutor present a bill and the AP's office present a different bill and maybe Hawai'i or Maui present another. And that was something that I learned a tremendous amount, and I was asking Steve over my shoulder here as to whether that still exists and whether it's still operational. And that's one of my questions. I think not only does it create an opportunity for law enforcement to figure out how to improve the tools that they're working with, and the prosecutors in particular, but it also gives the legislature an opportunity to say these bills that bear that mark are actually supported throughout the state. And I thought that was something that question for, I guess, the Attorney General today and the group. Another thing that I noted was that the Department of Law Enforcement, I think the Attorney General said that it's been discussed for 20 years. Actually, it was discussed when I was the Attorney General, and that was 25 years ago. So, you can imagine that. And there were a lot of different groups who were against it, because there was a feeling that they would lose the power that they had being in different places. And hopefully, coming together, they'll get somebody who will, keep them on track. I think that was always one of my concerns as to why I was against it. I didn't know what their jurisdiction was that they were going to be, whether it was going to be probably away from the Attorney General's responsibilities, away from the prosecutors, and away from various people. But in that regard, I think that there are some issues that we do have to be very careful about. I'm sure the Attorney General and we were going to be talking a lot about that, and that is that not only do you have different authority on the federal side versus the state side, whether it's by subpoena or by trying to go get getting your evidence from other ways, have the same issues in the Attorney General's office, because you do have investigative subpoena power. But if you're using that, depending upon whether you're using it to go then and try to use it in a civil action, or if you're using civil opportunities to get discovery, and then trying to make it a criminal case, you have the same kinds of issues. And back when we were doing some of the Bishop State cases, we had civil cases and criminal cases going at the same time, and we were pummeled with motion after motion after motion as to the source of our evidence and whether or not it was improperly getting through these walls. And so I'm sure that that's something that defendants will use again if you have the special investigatory group, the corruption, fraud, and economic crimes group working with the complex litigation. I think that's just something that I'm sure will develop as it goes. When it comes to trying to actually promote the issue of the corruption, I will tell you that 25 years ago, there was a tremendous amount of effort to try and stop a lot of cases. So there were a lot of people who tried to give us information that were stopped. There was a lot of effort to develop cases that we were told in no uncertain terms that it would come back to haunt us if we pursued them. And I'm certainly hoping that that is not the case anymore. I think the fact that the people have really been excited about the fact that some of the public corruption cases are being pursued, I think should really be a message to the legislature. But I think that the idea that there is a lot of corruption in Hawaii is not new. I was given a T-shirt years ago, and then Governor Ben Cayetano gave it to me, and it said, he said of all the people in the government, in the cabinet, he thought I was the one who should wear it, and it said, "Trust me, I work for government." And everybody started to laugh when he presented it to me. And quite frankly, most people laugh when I wear it, even to this day, because unfortunately, the government does not have a terribly good reputation. And I certainly hope that all the efforts that you're undertaking now will get people to the point where they can trust people, because there are so many good and giving people in government. And for all government workers to get a bad reputation, I think that that's for the bad apples is really a problem. A couple of sort of easy things that were mentioned today that I can't underscore enough. And that is the whole effort to make sure that our contracts, our grants, and everything else that the government gives out requires an affirmation or oath that you are complying with the terms of the grant, and that you're complying with the law, and that you are complying with some specific laws, and that there is an oath affirmation that everything in the document is true, and all of the commitments you're making are true. Because we found that as we were going through some of the cases that we were able to bring, we found that was probably the best thing, that when we actually did have the signed documentation that had the strong language, that was what we did. And unfortunately, there was a lot of laxness throughout government as to whether or not that actually made it into the documentation. We found that a lot of forms did have it, so that was great. A lot of the individual one, agreements did not. And so to me, that's a relatively easy thing to be able to help develop the evidence that you have. And I think there were a couple of people who mentioned that in terms of another question I had for the FBI, for that and Jeff, was when you're looking at a 666 case, I was curious as to what cases are falling through the cracks and not quite fit. Because I think that's really something that the state should be looking at. To the extent that the FBI is handed something, or a potential of something, what are the impediments, or what are the cases that you'd like to take, but just don't quite make it? And I think that could be useful in guiding this. And so that was a question that I had. And I think finally, we've talked about ethics. There was some talk about ethics. I know that that's an issue. And conflicts was mentioned by the person who was, I think Brady mentioned it at the beginning. And that too is an important question. When I was up for confirmation my second time, I had actually indicted one of the sitting senators. And when it came up that he was going to vote, the question came up as to whether or not he had a conflict in voting for my confirmation when he was being indicted by my office. It was decided by the ethics committee that he had no conflict at all. And so he did vote against my confirmation, not surprisingly, as did 12 others. But had he not been able to vote, it would have been a tie vote on my confirmation, and actually the lieutenant governor would have voted. I hope that reason. Sure. But so I think that the issue of conflicts should not be overlooked. And the issue of whether or not people should be able to participate in some of the government activities because of conflict, something that gives rise to potential for misuse and potentially criminal activity. And then the final word that I would just throw out is that the whole issue of the question of honest services. When we have a part-time legislature, and we have so many legislators, and we have so many spouses and families of legislators, there is a question that comes up. It certainly came up in my mind from time to time as to some of the people who had other jobs and part-time jobs and what they did for those jobs, and whether or not those actually gave rise to potential for backward things that could affect legislators' action. That was always something that came to mind with me. And we saw certain of the employee roles for UMass schools, Bishop State, back 25 years ago. We were quite astounded at some of the employment and questioned whether or not the work was being done. It didn't become a major issue for us But I think that that's a question that Judy was going to apologize for the rambling about a fraud. Thank you.
Marjorie, thanks so much for your insights and comments. Okay, so Doug, Chin? Is
Okay,
Doug still
here I am.
present?
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you all hear me? Aloha,
Yeah.
Aloha to Chair Foley, members of the commission, to all the county prosecutors, and of course to Attorney General Shikata and her team. I just wanted to say thank you very much to the commission for the time and the effort that you're putting into this very important effort, and to be thinking about just what could be better done to be able to prosecute fraud and public corruption in Hawaii. Really appreciate everything that you're doing. And also thank you for giving myself and former Attorney General Bronster the opportunity to be able to make comments. It actually feels like a very nice reunion. So I'm really glad to be able to, I'm gratified to be able to see all of you. So my instructions are to make comments, and so I just jotted down a few. First of all, I was really struck by Ms. Brady's first comments when she was talking about just how public officials often don't really seem to get their due when it comes to different ways that they engage in misconduct. And I can understand that, because I can see how oftentimes what it seems like happens is that if public officials are ever held accountable for something, it's not necessarily for fraud or public corruption, but it's for other ways that they violate the law, such as DUIs or shoplifting or something like that. I could see another venue that occurred prior to the great work that's been happening this year, where a lot of our administrative agencies, such as the Ethics Commission or the Campaign Spending Commission, would end up looking into ways that public officials were engaging in actions. And so sometimes that would result in a criminal referral, most likely to the Department of the Attorney General. But oftentimes what happened was that it was just some sort of administrative action. And so somebody would be looking at just basically answering to the Ethics Commission or answering to the Campaign Spending Commission. So the fact that there's this effort now to think about how to bring this more into the criminal prosecution arena and to highlight that, that's interesting, it's exciting, and I think the public is going to really appreciate the work that the commission and all of law enforcement and all of the elected folks are doing right now to be able to make that come about. Another comment that I made was I really appreciated just the comments from the partners over at the federal side and the state side and the local side. And I think one of the things that has always struck me whenever I've had the opportunity to be in public service is the great relationship in law enforcement that exists here in Hawaii between the federal, state, and local partners. I think it's unique. I think oftentimes there's turf wars and territorial wars in a lot of other jurisdictions. And I think what often happens is that because so many players seem to go in and out. I mean, here you have Prosecutor Alm and Ms. Nakakuni over at the city prosecutor's office, that there's an opportunity for all these relationships to be able to grow from the past and for people to be able to work together. So I think that's very promising. I'm on the police commission now, and I think when we selected Chief Logan to be the next police chief, I think one of the bonus points that we were all very excited about was the fact that Chief Logan actually came from the state, was originally with the tag, and then was part of the Attorney General's office, because that was a great indicator that as the city and county of Honolulu chief, he would be working really well with his state partners and his federal partners. And so we're very hopeful for that. If I were sitting on your commission, I would boil this down into three issues: laws, bandwidth, and tools. So I think the question would be, does the state have adequate laws to be able to combat fraud and public corruption? Does the state have adequate bandwidth to be able to do so? And then finally, does it have tools? So it certainly sounds like on the first issue, laws, that there's a lot of great efforts being made, either with the Hawaii Prosecutors Association or as a result of this commission, that's going to result in laws that are able to really add to the current laws that we have in the state. I think the second issue has always been bandwidth. I mean, my own sense is that the great work that you folks do at the city prosecutor's office and all the other counties as well involves a high volume. That there's just so many cases that come into your office to be able to prosecute and handle. And frankly, I think if you just take the relative size of the criminal justice division and the AG's office, it's the same thing as well. So to have bandwidth either in the county prosecutor's offices or specifically dedicated within the attorney general's office, that's very gratifying and promising for how these cases might be able to be prosecuted in the future. So lastly, I'll just say something about tools. And I think that that's something that that the commission should just have in the back of their mind. And I'm really making these comments more from a practical perspective that I think oftentimes one of the things that those of us who've been in law enforcement have experienced is that sometimes I think our state constitution or the way our state constitution is interpreted will often result in, practically speaking, will result in greater limitations in terms of being able to effectively prosecute these kinds of cases. So just, and it's certainly not I mean, I think that's just the way it is. And so a practical reality is that, we have to look at how whatever laws get passed, whether they will pass muster when it goes up for appeal in front of our various judges. One example of that is that during my term as Attorney General, then the Criminal Justice Division in the Attorney General's office was able to prosecute and bring criminal charges against a former Hawaii County mayor. And so those were on fraud and corruption charges. And so the office was able to successfully obtain an indictment and a return from the grand jury in order to be able to bring those charges all the way to trial. And then ultimately, the former county mayor was found not guilty by a jury of his peers. I certainly don't want to make any comments on that. We respect the jury verdict. I think if you were to talk to people back at the office about their own experience, I think there might be some anecdotal information about just how people felt about how the judge who was sitting there trying the case blocked out certain pieces of evidence or wouldn't allow certain things to be in front of the jury. And that was, again, just based on how they were viewing things. And so, and of course, I think all of us in law enforcement know that once someone's acquitted, there's no room to appeal that because the person has been acquitted. So it just goes its own way. So I just think that's something to consider. I think the other thing that I heard that might also be a limitation is just comes in terms of how the state at the state level, how they look at sentencing guidelines and really how they view prison versus probation and all of the issues that surround that, which are important issues. But I think the reality is that oftentimes state sentencing is not the same, shall we say, as federal sentencing guidelines or how people might be treated within the federal system. And so that might also present certain limitations. To me, I mean, I think that might be a little more than what the commission would really be wanting to take on or handle. But I think the comfort that everybody can get from that is that where the state might have certain, and I'm just going to characterize them as limitations, where the state might have certain limitations in these areas in terms of how effectively they can prosecute these fraud or corruption charges, that's where the federal partners can be able to step in and to be able to be helpful there. So with all that, kudos to all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and we look forward to seeing the great report and results that come from your commission's efforts. So thank you.
Any questions for Doug Chin? Doug, thanks for your comments.
Okay. Aloha, guys. Bye, everybody.
Okay, now we have 3 of the state's 4 prosecuting attorneys present, 2 by Zoom. And that would be Ms. Like and Mr. Martin. Are you there?
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi. So Mr. Martin, would you like to go first?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
You know, when I went to law school to be a prosecutor, and I've been an attorney now for 18 years. The majority of my time as an attorney has been as a prosecutor. And it was very early on in my career that I had my first opportunity to prosecute a public servant. It's never been something that I have felt any hesitation about. I think it's important that as a prosecutor and as a fellow public servant, that we recognize that as so many of the people here today have said, when public servants, whether it's an act of corruption or a separate criminal act outside of their duties, those acts erode trust in government. And I think it's important that government respond appropriately in order to restore that trust. At that first sentencing hearing I had, the defense attorney made an argument that has always stuck with me and really, I think, informs my comments to the commission today. The argument was made during sentencing that this particular individual shouldn't be treated any differently than any other defendant that comes before the court just because he happened to be a public servant. And when it came for my time to present my sentencing argument, I couldn't have disagreed more strongly with that sentiment. In this particular instance, this was an individual who had raised his right hand and sworn to defend the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Hawaii, and faithfully discharge his duties as a public servant. My argument at the time that doesn't make him like everyone else. That very much separates him and makes this a very different kind of case. And I think regardless of whether it is an instance where you have a public official or a particular type of public servant who takes an oath to fulfill their responsibilities, all public servants need to be held to a higher standard. That servant part, that service to our community, to the taxpayers, I think can never be forgotten or brushed aside. And so I think, you know, the approach to these types of cases, that always needs to be kept in the back of everyone's mind. And I think in my, I guess, some of my recommendations for the commission today flow from that type of idea and that experience that I had many years ago. I couldn't agree more with Mr. Alm about exploring the possibility of mandatory sentences for individuals who are public servants, and particularly those who, specifically those who defraud, steal from, embezzle from the government. For the reasons he stated, I think that is, and former Attorney General Chin just remarked on, having that that tool, that extra tool in our kit to be able to ensure that at least that maximum, an appropriate maximum sentence is set, I think is important. And it goes back to that first point that I was making with respect that when this type of conduct erodes trust in government, government must respond appropriately in order to restore that trust. And so that's one of the things I think that the commission and my fellow prosecutors and I need to really consider in terms of presenting something like that to you folks, to the legislature, along with, I think, a consideration for a special classification of offenders who commit acts of fraud, theft, and embezzlement against the government. You know, most of the cases that I've handled here in Maui County, specific to public corruption by public servants, has involved everything from similar to the former county mayor that Attorney General Chin referenced abuse of P cards. There's been theft by way of abuse of overtime, time cards, false vacation requests, and there have been conspiracies among several public servants to commit these types of actions. I think that when you get to that level, and where a public servant is involved from basically stealing or defrauding the taxpayers, we need to have something on the books that makes that a class different than theft committed by other individuals. And so, to use the example of, say, Class C fraud cases, Class C theft cases, where the amounts involved, anything between $750 and $20,000 is a Class C felony. I think we need to look at setting amounts for those types of cases, more similar to what the honest services fraud statute indicates, that $5,000 level. Look at that amount that would raise the classification for violations to a Class B felony for public servants who defraud the government. I think that is another tool that not only demonstrates to the public that we as government are serious about our response to corruption in government, but it also gives us that tool that Mr. Alm, I think, so appropriately referenced in terms of our ability to let people know what the ultimate outcome is and make sure that we get all the information that we need during the investigation phase to be able to fully investigate these cases. Those are my recommendations for the commission. I'm happy to answer any questions specific to Maui or the state that anyone may have. Thank you.
If there are no questions for Andy, thanks very much for your comments and insight. And Rebecca, okay.
Aloha, I'm Rebecca Like. I'm the prosecuting attorney from the island of Kauai. I'm happy to be here today to talk about some of the things that the commission has already touched on. I did have the chance to review your prior meetings and found them very interesting and informative. And I did look over the report that was generated in March. I know that was kind of a early report. But what really stood out to me of interest were increasing campaign spending regulations, which I know is somewhat, well, pretty much outside the purview of the prosecutor's offices. But as someone who, this was my first time running for office and going through that experience, it seems like there's some additional rules that could be put in place in regards to lobbying and the acceptance of large donations and perhaps an increased reliance on public funding. So that was my sort of initial take on familiarizing myself with this topic. In regards to expanding state law to prosecute these type of offenses, I've been at the prosecutor's office here for about 13 years, and what I've dealt with in my time here have been larger scale thefts and frauds, mainly for folks who are receiving cash payments at county offices for various services that are provided. So that doesn't really fall, I guess, under the public officials aspect, but as public employees, they did take money from residents. And then there have been two pretty high profile cases that came out of Kauai most recently in regards to a former council member, and another one had to do with another county office, but both of those were handled by the feds. And, as the FBI agents mentioned, and has been my experience in working with larger cases, they really have additional tools that we don't have at our disposal. And I think it would be extremely challenging to try to implement some of those strategies at the state level. We're just more restricted, rightfully so, because we're typically working at a lower threshold as to what sort of tools we can use investigatively. but I'm certainly open to exploring the things that Mr. Martin and Mr. Alm discussed in regards to creating a specific class of theft in regards to public servants and possibly having a mandatory minimum sentence. But the reality is, especially here on Kauai, where we're the smallest jurisdiction, our law enforcement tools are really limited. So if a situation did arise in a public corruption case, I would anticipate that we would probably need to capitalize on some of the resources at the state level in order to do that investigation. So those are just my thoughts and comments. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And if you have any questions or comments for me, I'm happy to try to address them.
Any questions for Rebecca? If not, Rebecca, thanks for your comments and insights. And Steve, since you're also a prosecutor.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep it short. White collar crime, I always appreciated the attorney's office because they went to prison just like everybody else. And often the white collar criminals look like the judges, and it's hard to get them sent to prison, which is why a couple of things. I increased the size of our white collar section from 1.5 deputies to 4. But I really, again, to bring up what has been discussed about mandatory time, including a mandatory minimum, because as I've said, the voting party can do whatever they want. And that's the danger that white collar people can present so well that it's harder to send them to prison. I have to say, Bob Wattada, when he was head of the Campaign Spending Commission, they did a lot of investigations, sent them over to the prosecutor's office. So as a judge, I had a number of misdemeanor campaign spending violation cases, and I sent them all to jail for like 10 days, 2 weeks, and my God, it was like I was telling them, no, I don't think another judge gave them a day in jail, which just cheapens somebody compared to a parking ticket. It's like, this is a corrupt system. You didn't start it, but you kept it going. And I even had the very first one was some high-profile lawyer, and I said, I'd like to give 10 days in jail. And that afternoon, I got a visit from the defense attorney and the city hall of prosecutors saying, like, that is not how you stop this. As I said, we all in this room probably know violent crime is really hard to deter. Nobody thinks about what I might get in prison for hitting somebody with a 2x4. But when it comes to political corruption, when it comes to white collar crime, that is a cost benefit analysis that people make. And if they know they're going to go to prison, I think it can really help. So I'm really happy with what you folks are doing. I think it's providing an incentive for all of us and all the prosecutors, the AG and the county prosecutors, to try to take advantage of this setting where the legislators might well be more open to changing the laws about corruption. And I look forward to taking part in that process.
Thank you. So to close, here are some thoughts. So drafting proposed legislation is just part of the solution. Because of the secretive nature of bribes and all these shady deals involved in all these cases, these crimes are really difficult to detect and even harder to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, because I've tried these cases. And somebody said the only way we're going to be successful in doing that, in doing all this, is if we collectively have the political will to say, we're not going to tolerate corruption because it erodes public trust. And I think, and the judge and I talked about this earlier, the timing is right now for this commission and the attorney generals and the prosecutors to be proposing tougher laws to prevent, deter, and punish people who engage in this corrupt activity. And they should be held accountable. And so, as others have said, they should go to prison, no probation, no deferral, even if they're first time, because these white collar criminals are almost always first time offenders, always. And they should also pay a significant fine and be forced to disgorge their ill-gotten gains. And my partner down there, Barbara, any?
I really have a kind of a radical idea. Our jails and prisons are so full. And, I was wondering what the prosecutors would think if I mentioned that, maybe some of the sentences should be shortened just to provide more space for, you know, people who should be in jail because they're violent criminals or because they, you know, should serve some time. We're just storing human beings, and I don't think they're improving themselves or society. So I think that's something that we can think about, but I don't think we could go into it at length. But it's one of those things where we have a physical problem of human storage. So I'd like you to think about that.
So I wanted to ask a follow-up question about contracts, because we discussed the idea of pay to play in the session on campaign spending. And Ms. Bronster again brought up the importance of having affirmation statements on the contracts. But if I remember correctly, we learned in the campaign spending session that there's no database of who is currently bidding on big state contracts. The Campaign Spending Commission knew about who was the current contractor, but it seemed like there was a big gap in, you know, the idea of people who might be wanting to buy the business.
You know what I think? What I think we're talking about though is even before that. When people submit forms or submit forms to for government contracts, they're providing information on state forms. And I think what the suggestion has been is that all of these forms should contain an affirmation the way that almost every federal form does. And these federal forms cite 1001. So, and we know what that means. I mean, and so the state forms, except for the tax forms, I think, are lacking. I don't see it in any state form.
So this would be, the person would be sort of certifying that the bidding was conducted in accordance with.
The person would be certifying that whatever I'm submitting now, my bid is true and correct.
Yes, and I'm asking a slightly different question.
Okay.
I'm asking about the situation where, all right, I've submitted a bid, everything in here is correct, but oh, by the way, there was plenty of competition for this business, so I gave somebody a bribe. I hastened this with a member of the legislature.
I mean,
Kind
something
of off the table.
Yeah, that statement that they're signing when they submit the bid, that they, that they did not provide anybody with any money
Okay.
or, yeah, that should be included in that statement when they're submitting their bid, that they sign off that everything is true and correct. And there's nothing that they did that was fraudulent to obtain this, to include giving somebody.
So I'm puzzled about why we were told in that campaign spending session that they wouldn't have a database of contracts, which they were recently, executed, because apparently there is.
I do remember that, but going forward, maybe new forms can be generated that have that language.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's been a long day, and we certainly appreciate your input. And Judge, we may be asking them for more input.
I'd like to thank everyone, and really looking forward to law enforcement, state and county recommendations on how to strengthen our public corruption statutes. I think it will get a very warm welcome from this commission. And as Flo mentioned, I think now is the time that the commission and law enforcement working together can really get it done in this forthcoming session. So I want to thank everyone, not only for the testimony, but for your service, your past service, current service. Deeply appreciated by everyone. And so the only other matter really is our next meeting will be July 27th here, 2 p.m. on open government laws. And anything else you have for our commission, our doors are always open. Just please contact us. Thank you very much.